Right, welcome to the Explainer. Today we're going to peel back the gold plating on the Gilded Age. Because, beyond all those titans of industry and their sprawling mansions, there was this massive battle being waged for the country's soul. And that's what we're diving into.
All right, so let's get right into it. The whole Gilded Age, the entire era, was basically defined by this huge, glaring contradiction. It was like a tale of two Americas, really. You had this nation just exploding with incredible wealth and innovation. But at the exact same time, you had this devastating poverty and exploitation. And this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? It's the core conflict right there. On one side, you've got these titans of industry building these massive empires with pretty much zero rules. And on the other side, you have millions of people just enduring these brutal, brutal conditions for wages that could barely keep them alive. We're talking 12, 14-hour days in factories that were so dangerous, their lives are basically treated as disposable.
So, what was the philosophy behind all this? Well, the whole system was propped up by this idea of laissez-faire capitalism. The thinking was pretty simple. Government, you just step back. Let the market do its thing, run itself. And, well, no matter the human cost. And look, it was an engine for some truly immense growth, for sure. But man, it was also an engine for just as much suffering.
Now, this kind of inequality, it couldn't last forever. It wasn't going unnoticed. It was basically creating this moral and political boiling point. And that's when you see thinkers and activists starting to come forward with some truly radical new ideas for how to structure the economy and society itself.
First up, let's talk about the economist Henry George. This guy, he looked around at this incredibly wealthy nation, and he was just baffled by all the poverty he saw. For him, this wasn't just some natural outcome of progress. No, he saw it as a fundamental flaw, like a bug in the whole system.
So what was his big idea? It was something he called the single tax. And what's really fascinating here is what he wanted to tax. It wasn't your income, it wasn't business profits. It was the unearned increment that comes from land value. Think about it. George argued that when a community grows, builds roads, schools, whatever, the land value just skyrockets. He saw that as wealth the landowner didn't actually earn. So his solution? Tax that wealth, 100% of it, to fund the government and spread the wealth around, all without discouraging people from actually working.
Okay, so not everyone was thinking about tax policy. Others took a totally different approach. Instead of a specific economic fix, writers like Edward Bellamy, they use storytelling. They try to get people to imagine a completely different future, a kind of utopia. And boy, did it capture the public's imagination.
His novel from 1888, Looking Backward, was an absolute sensation. A total phenomenon. The story is about a guy who wakes up in the year 2000 to find America has become this peaceful, efficient, socialist utopia where everyone is taken care of. Now, you have to remember, this was an age of just brutal dog-eat-dog competition. So the real power of this book was that it made this really radical idea seem, rational, orderly, and frankly, deeply desirable to millions of readers.
And these ideas, they weren't just stuck in books. They were fueling actual political movements, led by these incredibly charismatic and just tireless figures. A perfect example is the labor leader Eugene V. Debs.
Debs was someone who really lived this struggle. He started out as a labor organizer, right? But after he saw strike after strike get violently crushed, not just by corporate power, but with the government's help, he just came to the conclusion that the whole system was fundamentally broken. And that's what turned him into a socialist. He went on to co-found the Socialist Party of America and ran for president 5 times. And his goal wasn't really to win, not at first anyway. It was to use those campaigns to build a mass movement, to educate people and organize for real systemic change. So you've got these big economic critiques happening, but the political system, it just wasn't responding. So a lot of people started to see the inequality of the era as something more than just a policy problem. To them, it was a profound spiritual and moral crisis. And this feeling gave rise to something called the social gospel. You had religious leaders who started arguing that, saving individual souls, that's not enough. They believed Christians had a moral duty to redeem society itself. And that changed everything. Suddenly, poverty and exploitation weren't just things for politicians to debate. They were sins. And the church had a moral obligation to stand up and confront them head on.
But to really spark that kind of moral awakening, the reformers had a big job to do. They had to make the suffering of the urban poor completely impossible for the middle and upper classes to ignore. And this was a task that was just
perfectly suited for a journalist and photographer named Jacob Riis. And what's so incredible here is the technology he used. Riis got his hands on this brand new invention, flash photography. And with it, he could go inside these dark, crowded tenement buildings, places that comfortable, polite society had literally never seen before. His book, How the Other Half Lives, was just filled with this undeniable, shocking proof of the squalor, the disease, the sheer human misery. And it worked. It created a massive public outcry that led directly to some of the first real housing and sanitation reforms in the country. Now, this moral awakening, it was powerfully channeled by women. Remember, they were denied the right to vote, so they couldn't work within the system. Instead, they became absolute masters of grassroots organizing, building these huge, powerful movements completely outside of formal politics.
And when I say huge, I mean the scale of their organizing was just enormous. Take the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. For them, alcohol abuse wasn't just some personal failing. They saw it as a root cause of poverty and domestic violence. And get this, by the late 1890s, they had 500,000 members, 500,000. That made them one of the largest and most powerful organizations in the entire country, a true political force to be reckoned with. And a lot of that power came from the vision of its president, Frances Willard. She had this do-everything policy. It was brilliant, really. She connected the fight against alcohol to, well, everything. Workers' rights, public health, sanitation, you name it. And crucially, she's the one who framed women's suffrage as the home protection ballot. The argument was simple and powerful. Women needed the vote to protect their homes, their families, and their communities.
Of course, not everyone was into policy and lobbying. The movement also had its, let's say, its more militant wing, perfectly embodied by Carrie Nation. She was famous for her direct action tactics. I mean, she would literally march into saloons with a hatchet and just start smashing barrels of liquor. Now, obviously this was controversial, but her confrontational style absolutely kept the issue in the headlines. You just couldn't ignore her.
Another key innovation, also driven by women, was the settlement house movement. You had pioneers like Jane Addams with her famous Hull House in Chicago. These places were community centers right in the heart of poor immigrant neighborhoods, providing vital services like daycare and healthcare. But they were also something more. They were laboratories for social reform. College-educated women would actually live in these communities, gather hard data on poverty and working conditions, and then use that evidence to push for real legislative change. They were basically training grounds for an entire generation of female reformers.
And it's so important to understand that this fight for reform wasn't just one single movement. It wasn't monolithic at all. For women of color, like Mary Church Terrell, it was a battle against what she called the double burden of both racism and sexism. And for Indigenous activists like Zitkala Shaw, getting the vote wasn't just about politics. It was a tool to resist cultural erasure and to fight for their sovereignty. Their struggles were unique, and they are absolutely essential parts of this story.
Okay, so what happens when you take all of these different pieces, all these movements, these ideas, these different strategies, and you put them all together? Well, what you get is a fundamental shift in the American consciousness, a real sea change. You get this multifaceted attack on the problems of the Gilded Age, coming from all sides at once. You have these radical economic theories challenging the very foundation of the system. You have moral crusades that are awakening the nation's conscience. And all the while, you have this relentless grassroots organizing that's building real, tangible political power from the ground up. And all this constant pressure coming from so many different directions, it effectively spelled the end for the era of pure, unchecked, laissez-faire capitalism. It laid all the groundwork for what would become the progressive era. It injected these brand new ideas, or at least newly popular ones, of social responsibility and government regulation right into the national conversation. And these are ideas that are at the very heart of the debates we're still having today, about things like the minimum wage, corporate taxes, and the social safety net.
So that leaves us with a final question to chew on. When you look at all these different strategies, the radical economic theories, the shocking media crusades, the slow and steady grassroots organizing, which one do you think was really the most effective at forcing change back then? Which one really made the biggest dent in the system? It's definitely something to think about.